The year was 1837, a winter marked by bitter winds and whispers that never seemed to die. Snow blanketed Lancaster County in a hush that muffled the roads and barns, but beneath the stillness lurked unrest. Families carried secrets in the marrow of their bones, and in the farmhouses that dotted the countryside, tragedy often followed the scent of inheritance. Tonight our story begins not with a single death, but with the slow unraveling of a family name that would come to haunt Pennsylvania's history. Welcome back. Before we continue, like, subscribe, share. What I am about to recount has been pieced together from scattered journals, courthouse records, and the private papers of physicians who dared to diagnose what they could not cure. To read them today is to glimpse a shadow of lives polished on the outside yet rotting at the root. The tale of the Harrow sisters is not a single incident of malice but a pattern woven, rehearsed, and perfected. The Harrow family, descended from a once respected line of landowners, lived on a stone farmstead a few miles outside the township of Strasburg. Their mother, Eleanor Harrow, had died young in 1825, leaving behind 4 daughters, Clara, Isabel, Ruth, and Jane. Their father, Thomas Harrow, was said to be a man of severity, sharp with his tongue and sharper still with the cane he kept by his chair. He passed in 1831, leaving his daughters the farm, modest debts, and an education more thorough than most women of the county ever received. Unlike many young women of their time, the sisters did not disperse into neighboring households through marriage. They stayed together, under one roof, each assuming duties of the estate and acquiring reputations in the community. Clara, the eldest, was regarded as composed and articulate, Isabel striking in appearance but guarded, Ruth soft-spoken with a sharp memory for accounts, and Jane, the youngest, with eyes that people described as too knowing for her age. At first the Harrows attracted sympathy. 4 young women attempting to manage a farm alone was no small feat. Neighbors extended credit, labor, and kindness. Yet as the years progressed, that sympathy curdled into suspicion, for where the Harrows went, death soon followed. The first incident occurred in 1837 when Clara, then 25, married Edward Mallory, a prosperous merchant from Philadelphia who sought a country estate. Their union was spoken of as advantageous. His money secured the farm, her diligence promised him heir. But within a year, Edward was dead, collapsed after supper one evening, his body convulsing with violent spasms before the physician could be summoned. The physician, Dr. Samuel Pritchard, attributed the death to apoplexy, yet some remarked how quickly Clara donned her mourning dress, how efficiently the estate was transferred into her control, and how the sisters moved about the house with an air not of grief but of grim purpose. Edward's family in Philadelphia questioned the matter, but their inquiries were met with silence. The official record lists the cause of death as natural. It was not the first time tragedy had touched the Harrows, but it was the first time the community began to whisper that misfortune followed them too consistently to be chance. In the months that followed, visitors noted strange habits in the household. The sisters kept meticulous notebooks of expenditures and medical remedies, as though rehearsing accounts for an unseen audience. Herbal tinctures lined their shelves, some common, some less so. One neighbor, Miss Hensley, later recalled an evening when she found Jane grinding a powder in the kitchen mortar, her face alight with focus. When asked what it was for, Jane answered simply, "For the heart." The Harrows also became reclusive. Curtains were drawn even on fair days, and they discouraged neighbors from entering the house. Those who did gain entry, clergy, physicians, or creditors, reported an atmosphere heavy with silence. Portraits of their parents watched from the walls with stern expressions, and the hearth seemed always to burn too hot, as if masking some other scent. Meanwhile, Clara was seen meeting discreetly with lawyers in town, arranging the transfer of Mallory's investment. The efficiency with which she executed these matters left even men of the law astonished. Some wondered whether she had been planning them long before Edward's death. What makes the Harrow story singular is not the occurrence of death itself. Lancaster County was no stranger to illness, accidents, and grief, but the pattern that emerged. Within 3 years, each sister would be linked to the death of a man who entered their circle. Isabel, whose beauty attracted suitors readily, married Nathaniel Green, a land surveyor. He perished within months of their wedding, reportedly of a fever of the stomach, though one physician quietly suggested poison. Ruth, in her turn, was courted by Charles Turner, a widower with 2 children. He drowned in the creek behind the Harrow farm under circumstances that were never fully explained. And Jane, youngest, quietest, and perhaps most unnerving, was said to have been promised to Henry Albright, a school teacher. He too died suddenly, his lungs filling with fluid as though he had inhaled poison. Each time the Harrows mourned in public and prospered in private. Estates were transferred, land acquired, debts settled. What began as survival soon looked very much like strategy, but suspicion, like rot beneath floorboards, cannot remain hidden forever. By late 1839, Judge Samuel Whitfield of Lancaster had received multiple petitions from grieving families, demanding investigation. He assigned a young attorney, Daniel Holt, to examine the Harrow affairs. Holt was diligent if inexperienced. He visited the farm under pretense of social courtesy, observing the sisters at their meals and noting the arrangement of their household. His notes, later discovered among court papers, contain chilling detail. They are four in body, yet one in mind. Speech is measured, as though Clara dominates, Isabel entices, Ruth records, and Jane watches everything. Holt also collected testimony from servants who had briefly worked at the farm. One maid, dismissed after a fortnight, claimed she was ordered never to taste the food prepared for guests. Another reported hearing Clara instruct Isabel in the preparation of a powder to quiet the nerves. Still without physical evidence, Holt could not proceed. The law required proof beyond suspicion, and the Harrows, adept at managing appearances, left little trace. Yet traces remain. In 1840, a small leather-bound journal surfaced in town, offered by an apothecary who had sold tinctures to Jane. It contained notes in Ruth's hand recording quantities of belladonna, arsenic, and laudanum purchased over several years. The apothecary claimed he had thought little of it. Many households kept such remedies, but when word of the sisters' reputation reached him, he reconsidered. The journal was delivered to Judge Whitfield, who sealed it among his private papers. To this day, its authenticity remains debated. Some scholars argue it was genuine evidence of systematic poisoning. Others suggest it was fabricated by those eager to see the sisters punished. What is certain is that by the early 1840s, the Harrow name had become synonymous with drug. Families whispered warnings to their sons, "Beware the Harrow women." Ministers preached sermons on the dangers of temptation and inheritance, and yet nothing was done. The sisters remained in their stone farmhouse, wealthy, unwed, and untouchable. Perhaps the most chilling detail is this. After Edward Mallory's death, Clara commissioned a new wing of the farmhouse, with rooms that opened not to the front, but to the rear fields. Few outsiders ever saw in. Those who did described long hallways, shuttered windows, and the faint odor of tinctures. One visitor, a circuit preacher, later wrote in his journal, "I felt as though the air itself was complicit, heavy with secrets not meant for daylight." The Harrows lived as though history itself were watching, recording, and preparing to judge. And history, as we shall see, did not disappoint. The mystery of the Harrow sisters begins here, with whispers of poison, sudden deaths, and journals that may yet contain the truth. But this is only the beginning. What followed in the next years would expose a conspiracy so elaborate, so coldly calculated, that it still chills the archives of Lancaster County nearly 2 centuries later. The Harrow farm did not fall into ruin after Edward Mallory's death. Quite the opposite. It seemed to prosper. The estate expanded, debts were erased, and the sisters carried themselves with a confidence that made neighbors uneasy. They were polite when required, cordial in church pews, but there was always something too composed about their bearing, as though each gesture had been practiced before a mirror. By 1838, the farm had become the talk of Lancaster County, yet the conversations were not about crops or cattle, but about the strange rhythm of tragedy that pulsed within its walls. Clara appeared in town less often, except to meet with attorneys. Isabel was glimpsed in the company of suitors who never stayed long. Ruth managed the accounts with precision that suggested more than simple bookkeeping, and Jane, though still young, was seen purchasing tinctures from apothecaries, with an assurance that belied her years. The locals whispered, but whispers rarely rose to accusation. Lancaster County, conservative and bound by propriety, hesitated to believe evil could flourish under a woman's hand. To accuse 4 sisters of conspiracy and murder would have required proof no one dared claim to possess. Yet fragments of unease began to accumulate, like snow along the fence posts. The first came from Pastor Elijah Crane, who had known the Harrows since their childhood. He recounted a visit in early spring of 1838, when he stopped by the farm unannounced. Clara greeted him with her usual composure, though he noted her reluctance to admit him past the entryway. Still, as he pressed his duty as shepherd of their souls, she relented and allowed him into the parlor. There he observed something peculiar. On the mantel stood 4 small glass vials, each neatly labeled with initials C.I. The liquid within varied in color, one amber, one pale, one nearly black. Pastor Crane inquired after them, to which Clara replied smoothly, "They are restoratives, for the no." But the pastor noticed the faint chemical odor rising from the glass. Unlike any cordial he had encountered, he made mention of it in his journal. "Their home is ordered, yet not peaceful. I felt as though the Lord's eye did not rest upon that place." The sisters moved about me as though rehearsed, speaking in turn, each line delivered like actors upon a stage. He left unsettled, though uncertain whether his fears were mere superstition. The second account came from Mary Whitaker, a seamstress hired to repair garments for Isabel. She recalled how the sisters insisted she remain in the kitchen while fittings were conducted, never in the private rooms. Once, when Isabel retrieved a bodice from her chamber, Mary glimpsed beyond the door a desk scattered with letters and notes. On top of the pile lay what looked like a diagram of the human body, with marks made near the chest and stomach. Mary said nothing at the time, but she confided in her brother weeks later. Her brother, skeptical, dismissed it as a medical pamphlet, yet the image lingered in Mary's memory, haunting her dreams long after she ceased working for the Harrow. The third clue surfaced in the form of testimony from a stable boy, Thomas Greer, who claimed he had once delivered hay to the Harrow property. As he carried the bales to the rear barn, he overheard the sisters speaking through an open window. The words chilled him. "He will not last the summer," one voice declared. Another answered, "It must appear as the fever, no questions." A third added, "The papers are ready, all that remains is his pass." The boy fled before hearing more, convinced he had intruded upon matters too dangerous to repeat. He did not speak of it until years later, when the sisters' names had already darkened Lancaster's history. While these accounts remained private, one development could not be ignored. In 1839, Isabel's husband, Nathaniel Green, collapsed during a county gathering, his face pale, his body racked with vomiting. He died within days. The attending physician again declared disease of the stomach, though several witnesses remembered seeing Clara guide the doctor aside, pressing him with grave insistence that Nathaniel had long been delicate. What startled the community most, however, was the sisters' composure at his funeral. Isabel wept, yes, but her tears seemed measured, as though summoned at will. Ruth handled the legal documents with brisk efficiency, and Jane, though barely 17, stood by the graveside with an expression that several attendees later described as triumphant. The Green family attempted to contest the inheritance, but Isabel produced papers properly witnessed and signed, granting her significant control of Nathaniel's assets. The law, once again, sided with the Harrows. By now Judge Samuel Whitfield had grown uneasy. Reports from the Mallory and Green families had crossed his desk, and though he lacked evidence, the repetition of circumstance could no longer be ignored. He summoned Daniel Holt, the young attorney, and instructed him to observe, inquire and record. Holt began his inquiries discreetly. He visited the farm under pretense of purchasing grain, and observed the sisters in their element. What struck him was their unity. Each word spoken seemed calibrated, each silence deliberate. He described them in a memorandum: 4 minds bound together, sharper than any man would credit. If one falters, the other 3 supply the line. It is a choreography of speech. Holt also noted peculiarities in their household: the curtains drawn even on bright mornings, the locked cabinet in the kitchen, and the ledger kept by Ruth in which she recorded not only farm expenses, but also quantities of substances unfamiliar to him. Still, Holt could find no grounds for prosecution. Lancaster's law required material proof, and the sisters, meticulous as they were, left none. It was around this time that whispers of Jane's engagement to Henry Albright, the school teacher, began. Albright was respected for his patience and learning, a man devoted to his students. Many in town hoped his union with Jane might temper the family's reputation. Yet before the wedding could take place, Albright fell ill. His skin yellowed, his body weakened, his breath laboured. He died within a week. The physician recorded it as dropsy of the lungs. Jane wore mourning black, but those who saw her swore she did not shed a tear. Instead, she stood silent at the grave, her gaze fixed upon the horizon as if measuring what lay ahead. By now, 3 men connected to the Harrows had died under their roof or their influence. To the wider world, such events might be misfortune. To Lancaster County, bound by gossip and memory, it was a pattern. The sisters' isolation deepened. They rarely attended. They paid laborers promptly, but dismissed them after brief stints. They received callers only in the parlor, never be. The farmhouse grew notorious for its silence, broken only by the faint strains of piano played late at night. Clara's hand, most believed, practicing hymns that sounded less like devotion than lament.
Gasps filled the chamber. Clara struck the table with her fist, cursing her sister's weakness. But it was too late.
The unity that had shielded them for years was destroyed by the youngest among them. The verdict was unanimous. Clara Isabel and Ruth Harrow were found guilty of murder and conspiracy. Jane, owing to her youth and her confession, was spared the noose but condemned to life imprisonment. On March 15, 1841, exactly 3 years to the day since the first recorded death in their circle, the 3 elder sisters were hanged at Moyamensing Prison in Philadelphia. Contemporary accounts describe the scene in chilling detail. Clara stood defiant to the end, declaring that history would call them martyrs to female independence. Isabel collapsed in sobs, clinging to the priest's hand. Ruth said nothing, her eyes vacant, as though her soul had departed before the rope was drawn. The crowd, numbering in the hundreds, cheered as the trap fell. After the execution, their farmhouse was seized and eventually demolished. The land passed into new hands, but whispers lingered that the soil itself was cursed. Farmers spoke of crops failing in its fields, of livestock refusing to graze near the old foundation stones. Yet the story did not end in Lancaster. In the decades that followed, suspicious clusters of widows' fortunes surfaced in Maryland, Virginia, and Delaware. The same pattern, marriages brief, deaths sudden, inheritances swift, suggested that the Harrow method had been adopted elsewhere. Whether by imitators or accomplices, no one could say. In the annals of Pennsylvania law, the Harrow case established new precedent. It proved that women, too, could organize themselves into conspiracies, that domestic virtue could conceal systemic violence, and that the face of innocence might mask the hand of deliberate murder. Judge Whitfield, reflecting years later, wrote, "They taught us that evil need not roar to be feared. It may smile across a teacup, speak softly in the parlor, and still be no less deadly." The Harrows remind us that cruelty, when shared among kin, may harden into something stronger than iron. Today, the site of the Harrow farm is unremarkable, a stretch of suburban development where children play and shoppers walk without knowledge of the ground beneath their feet. Yet for those who study the darker passages of history, the memory remains. 4 sisters bound by blood and ambition turned their hearth into a crucible of death. Their legacy endures as a caution that behind the quiet facade of family, conspiracies may thrive unseen, that the very bonds meant to safeguard life may instead perfect the art of its destruction. And so the tale closes not with redemption but with warning. For in Lancaster County the shadow of the Harrows lingers still, a reminder that history's most terrible monsters are amenti those who sit smiling at the family table. The trial of the Harrow sisters left more than a spectacle of public outrage. It birthed a mountain of documents that scholars, magistrates, and physicians would puzzle over for decades. Between March and July of 1841, Lancaster County produced depositions, autopsy records, and sworn affidavits in such volume that entire trunks of papers were delivered to the Pennsylvania archive. Though the executions brought a visible end to the sisters' reign, what followed was in many ways more disturbing. The attempt to explain their crimes through science, medicine, and jurisprudence. It was as though society could not bear to leave their deeds as mere wickedness. They had to be studied, dissected, and if possible contained within language. The first of these inquiries came from Dr. Elias Partridge, a physician from Philadelphia who had testified at the trial. Commissioned by the state, Partridge undertook a series of chemical analyses upon what remained of the Harrows' stores, vials recovered from the farmhouse, powders scraped from ceramic cups, tinctures sealed in corked bottles hidden beneath loose board. His report, published later that year, revealed a staggering familiarity with arsenic trioxide. Nearly every vessel contained traces, mixed into herbal decoctions or disguised by honey and spirit. Partridge noted that the distribution was deliberate, measured, almost surgical in its precision. One cannot mistake the pattern. The hands that administered these substances understood not only their potency, but also their subtlety. Each dose appears calculated to weaken the body without alarming the mind, to erode health beneath the guise of natural decline. Such cunning betrays not accident but prolonged experiment. Partridge's chilling conclusion was that the Harrows had studied poison as though it were a science, refining dosage through trial until their victims perished without suspicion. Simultaneously, the legal community dissected the case for its precedent. Judge Whitfield's archive, once kept in cautious secrecy, was opened for review by colleagues from Philadelphia and Harrisburg. Letters between jurists debated not only the admissibility of Margaret's journal, but the greater question of whether conspiracy could be proved when bound by family tie. One letter from Justice Harlan reads, "If kinship shields the guilty, then the home becomes sanctuary for the most perfect crimes. The Harrow matter shows us that blood itself may be the most dangerous covenant, for who will betray a sister save another sister? In this debate lay the grim recognition that family, long assumed to be a natural safeguard, could serve as a fortress for criminal enterprise. More curious still were the attempts to explain the sisters' behavior through the lens of heredity. In the months following the trial, pamphlets circulated across Pennsylvania speculating that the Harrows carried a taint of moral corruption, inherited from a grandfather rumored to have died in debtor's prison. Amateur genealogists published lurid family trees, linking distant cousins to madness or suicide, as though to prove that the sisters' cruelty was woven into their blood. One such pamphlet, printed anonymously in Philadelphia in 1842, declared, "The Harrows demonstrate that wickedness may run as surely through veins as consumption or gout. It is not chance that 4 women raised in the same house should exhibit the same ruthless ambition. Rather, it is nature herself revealing her darker law." Modern readers may scoff at such pseudoscience, but in 1841, it was persuasive. For many, it was easier to believe the sisters were cursed by blood than to accept that ordinary women, sound in mind, could conspire to kill. Meanwhile, Jane Harrow, the youngest and sole survivor, languished in Eastern State Penitentiary. Records from the warden describe her as withdrawn, prone to long silences punctuated by sudden fits of weeping. She was kept in solitary confinement, as was the practice of the institution, and her cell log notes countless hours spent scratching shapes into the stone floor with a piece of broken pottery. One visiting chaplain wrote in his diary, "She repeats the names of her sisters as though they still walk beside her. At times she claims to see them standing at the foot of her bed, bidding her to finish what they began. It is my conviction that her guilt has shattered her reason, and that she will never know peace until death delivers her." Jane lived another 12 years in that cell. When she finally perished in 1853 of what was described as a wasting sickness, her last words reportedly were, "Tell Clara I did not betray her." The wider county struggled to reconcile itself to the scandal. Families once proud to call themselves neighbors of the Harrows now sought to erase the association. Old letters were burned, portraits removed from parlors, and marriage ties obscured in genealogical records. By mid-century, it was common to hear the name spoken only in whispers, as if acknowledging it too loudly might invite misfortune. Yet not all were content to forget. Folklore clung to the ruins of the Harrow farm long after its demolition. Children dared each other to walk the fields at night, swearing they heard voices calling from the empty foundations. One farmer who attempted to build a barn upon the site claimed his livestock sickened without cause until he abandoned the project entirely. Thus the Harrows passed into that uneasy space between history and legend, where fact and superstition blur until neither can be separated from the other. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of the records lies not in the crimes already known, but in the hints of others. Among Whitfield's surviving notes are references to letters intercepted in Delaware and Virginia, describing young widows who seemed to follow the Harrow pattern: swift marriages, sudden deaths, inheritances, too conveniently timed. Though never proven, the suggestion is chilling that the sisters' methods had spread, whether by imitation or instruction. The possibility that the Harrows had established a network of like-minded women, bound by secrecy and ambition, haunted the imagination of investigators long after the gallows. Whitfield himself, in a memorandum dated 1843, confessed, "It is my fear that Lancaster was but the beginning. What we witnessed in those 4 sisters may yet live on in other counties, in other households, hidden behind curtains of domestic piety. The Harrows may have been executed, but their design remains." Thus Part 5 closes not with resolution but with expansion, the sense that the crimes of Lancaster were neither isolated nor complete. The Harrow sisters, though hanged in Philadelphia, seemed to cast shadows far beyond the reach of rope or grave. Their legacy lingered in courtrooms, in medical treatises, in whispered superstitions, and perhaps even in new generations who studied their methods and took them for their own. And in that shadow, Lancaster County never fully healed. By 1845, the Harrow sisters' story had transformed from a criminal scandal into a subject of scholarly obsession, where the trial had satisfied the public's thirst for justice. The decades that followed sought explanation. Physicians, legal theorists, and reformers all turned their attention to Lancaster County, searching for a framework in which to contain the enormity of 4 sisters conspiring to kill. In the process, they built a strange afterlife for the Harrows, one preserved, not in flesh but in forensic charts, genealogical diagrams, and clinical reports. The most famous of these inquiries came from Dr. Silas Mott, a physician aligned with the Pennsylvania Medical Society. In 1846, he published a paper entitled On the Phenomena of Female Malice, which devoted 3 lengthy chapters to the Harrow case. Mott dissected the autopsy records with a zeal bordering on obsession. His tables listed weights of organs, colorations of the stomach lining, and concentrations of arsenic found in tissue samples. One entry noted that the liver of Samuel Carter, brother-in-law to Clara Harrow, was mottled in such a way as to suggest not sudden poisoning, but a gradual accretion, administered in sublethal increments over many weeks. From this, Mott argued that the sisters had perfected what he called the art of the slow kill, a method that concealed itself beneath the rhythms of natural decline. He warned his colleagues that such women could hide in plain sight, smiling at the hearth while measuring each draught with surgical precision. His conclusions scandalized the medical community, for they carried an unspoken premise that the domestic sphere itself could be a theater of calculated violence. In tandem, genealogists pursued their own lines of inquiry. By the late 1840s, Lancaster County was alive with whispered speculation about the Harrow bloodline. Family records were exhumed, wills scrutinized, and parish registers combed for patterns. The most infamous product of this zeal was the Harrow Register, a privately circulated booklet compiled by Amos Burdett, a schoolmaster with a taste for morbid detail. Burdett traced the family tree back 4 generations, highlighting every instance of untimely death, financial ruin, or rumored madness. According to his work, a great-aunt of the sisters had drowned herself in the Conestoga River, and a second cousin was said to have starved her children in an act of religious penance. Burdett presented these anecdotes not as coincidence, but as proof of what he called a hereditary. Though derided by serious historians, the booklet sold widely in Lancaster and Philadelphia, feeding the public appetite for the notion that the Harrows had been doomed by blood. Not all attempts at explanation sought pathology. In 1848, reformer Lydia Antrim delivered a lecture in Harrisburg titled, On the Corruption of Ambition in Women. Drawing heavily from the Harrow case, she argued that society itself had twisted the sisters' aspiration. Deny women the avenues of lawful power, she declared, and some will seek unlawful means. The Harrows desired wealth, independence, and recognition. What else could be expected when their only inheritance was a narrow lane of drudgery and obedience? Her words sparked outrage in conservative circles, but also planted an enduring seed, the notion that the Harrows were not merely monsters, but products of the constraints around them. To some, this was dangerous sympathy. To others, it was a sobering critique of gendered injustice. While scholars debated, Lancaster itself remained steeped in unease. Accounts from the late 1840s described strange occurrences at the abandoned Harrow farmstead. After the property was sold and dismantled, neighbors reported that tools left overnight on the grounds were found rusted by morning, as though decades of decay had been accelerated in a single night. One child swore he saw 4 women standing among the weeds, their faces pale and indistinct, whispering in unison. Farmers avoided the sight, claiming their horses refused to pass the crossroads at dusk. Though easily dismissed as superstition, these stories spread widely, merging with the scholarly fascination until the sisters existed both as subjects of learned debate and as ghosts of local folklore. Among the most disturbing archival fragments from this period is a letter from Judge Whitfield, dated 1850, 5 years before his death. By then he had retired from the bench, but the Harrows still haunted his thoughts. I have seen many criminals, yet none so troubling as those women. I cannot dispel the sense that we unearthed only a fraction of their design. Were I a younger man, I would urge a national inquiry, for I suspect that Lancaster was but one theater among many. The sisters may be gone, but their method, it may well be practiced, even now in households where no eye dares look too closely. Such words coming from a figure of authority rekindled whispers that the Harrows had left behind acolytes or imitators. This suspicion found grim reinforcement in a case from Delaware in 1851, where a young bride was accused of poisoning her husband with small doses of arsenic. Though no direct link to the Harrows could be proven, newspapers eagerly framed the trial as a daughter of Lancaster. The accused woman's bookshelf, seized by authorities, contained a journal of herbal remedies, eerily similar to Margaret Harrow's. Margins were filled with annotations on dosage, solubility, and concealment. Whether coincidence or inheritance, the parallel fanned fears that the Harrows' dark legacy had survived their execution, a recipe passed from hand to hand like forbidden scripture.
Meanwhile, in Eastern State Penitentiary, the last surviving sister, Jane, continued to spiral. Reports from 1850 describe her as emaciated, often refusing food, convinced that her meals were poisoned. A cruel irony, given her own history. Guards noted she spoke of her sisters nightly, holding whispered conversations as if the four remained united in their cause.
One entry in the chaplain's log reads, "She claims Clara visits her each dawn, urging her to confess not to man but to the blood itself." What this means I cannot fathom, but the prisoner appears tormented by vows unbroken. When Jane finally died in 1853, her remains were buried in an unmarked grave on the prison grounds. Within a year, rumors began that weeds grew from the soil in a peculiar formation. 4 stalks twisted together like hands clasped in defiance. By mid-century, the Harrow case had assumed a double life. In the archives, it was cited in legal textbooks, medical reports, and reformist tracts. In the streets, it was whispered as curse and legend. This duality, clinical record and haunted myth, ensured that the sisters could never truly vanish. They had become more than women. They were symbols of the fragility of family, of the perils of unchecked ambition, of the possibility that evil could wear the face of the familiar. And yet, as Whitfield had warned, the most unnerving question persisted: were the Harrows merely an aberration, or the first glimpse of a hidden current running through domestic life? The records offered no final answer. They only deepened the suspicion that Lancaster County had witnessed not an end, but a beginning. Thus, Part 6 closes with the Harrows fully absorbed into both scholarship and superstition. Their names, once confined to court ledgers, now echo in lecture halls, prison logs, and children's tales whispered by firelight. History had preserved them, but not contained them. The shadows they cast were only growing longer. By the early 1850s, Lancaster County was no longer alone in carrying the burden of the Harrow sisters' infamy. What had once been considered a provincial scandal had broadened into a national anxiety. Pamphlets, court documents, and whispered reports suggested that the Harrows' story was not self-contained, but part of a wider and darker pattern emerging across the young republic. It was during this period that the term Harrow doctrine began appearing in the writings of criminologists. The phrase denoted not merely a family's history of violence, but an entire methodology calculated, patient, and domestic in setting. One of the most unsettling contributions came from Dr. Augustin Vale, a physician and amateur statistician who published on the quiet poisoners of the interior in his work, though poorly received by some, circulated widely because of its meticulous compilations of unexplained death. Vale identified 43 cases of suspected slow poisoning between 1830 and 1850, scattered across Pennsylvania, Maryland, Delaware, and New Jersey. What unsettled his readers was not merely the number, but the uncanny similarity. In each case, the accused was a woman between the ages of 18 and 40, connected by marriage or inheritance to the victim. In nearly every instance, neighbors described the accused as dutiful, kind, or uncommonly attentive. Several, Vale noted, used nearly identical herbal blends to administer the poison. The Harrow affair, he concluded, was not an aberration, but a lantern held up to a darkness long unmeasured. It is my belief that we stand upon the threshold of a discovery, that there exists within our homes a covert tradition, a hidden apprenticeship, by which women teach one another the instruments of slow death. Though scoffed at by conservative journals, Vale's thesis struck a chord, for if true, it meant that the Harrows were not originators, but disciples of something older and more widespread. At the same time, reports from prisons and asylums began to surface that deepened this suspicion. In Sing Sing prison, a woman convicted of attempting to poison her husband spoke cryptically during her confession. "The sisters will not be forgotten. They have taught us to measure, to bide our time." Their words passed quietly, like water. Officials pressed her for clarification, but she lapsed into silence, refusing further explanation. The remark was published in New York newspapers, sparking a wave of speculation that the Harrow legacy had taken root beyond Lancaster. Meanwhile, Lancaster itself could not escape its association. Traveling lecturers began arriving in the county, turning the Harrow case into a kind of moral theater. Some warned of the dangers of female education, others of the hazards of unchecked domestic authority. At each gathering, the same question was raised: had the Harrows acted alone, or were they participants in a hidden covenant? Judge Whitfield's ominous line that Lancaster was but one theatre among many was quoted endlessly, until it became less a remark than a prophecy. The fear took its most vivid form in the press, where editors competed to link new crimes to the Harrows, a poisoning in Kentucky, a suspicious inheritance in Massachusetts, even the unexplained illness of a banker in Ohio. All were eagerly branded Lancaster Echo. In one particularly lurid pamphlet, a Philadelphia printer published a woodcut of 4 ghostly figures, standing over a map of the United States, their hands outstretched as veins of shadow radiated outward into every state. The caption read, "The Sisters Still Walk." Though sensational, such images resonated with the public's deepest anxieties, that the evil of the Harrows had escaped the noose, diffusing like a contagion through the bloodstream of the nation. This atmosphere of paranoia soon drew the attention of political reformers. In 1853, the Pennsylvania legislature debated a bill to expand restrictions on the sale of arsenic and strychnine. Supporters pointed directly to the Harrow case, arguing that unchecked access to such substances had transformed kitchens into laboratories of murder. Opponents dismissed this as hysteria, but the very fact of the debate demonstrated how deeply the Harrow name had sunk into civic discourse. To regulate poison was in effect to admit that the Harrows were not aberrations, but symptoms of a wider malady. While statesmen argued and physicians theorized, ordinary citizens found themselves haunted in subtler ways. Lancaster families reported anonymous notes left upon their doorsteps, scraps of paper bearing nothing but a name and a date. A widow in Columbia claimed to have received a lock of hair in the mail, wrapped in a page torn from the Harrow Register. Such incidents, whether the work of pranksters or true disciples, reinforced the belief that a hidden network operated beneath the surface of respectable life. In the midst of this unrest, a curious document emerged from the archives of Eastern State Penitentiary. It was a fragment of paper, unsigned, discovered inside a hollowed Bible once belonging to Jane Harrow. The handwriting, faint and jagged, read, "We were not alone." The circle continued. One hearth feeds another. What was taught will not be unlearned. Though impossible to verify, the fragment spread rapidly through Lancaster, reprinted in newspapers and whispered in taverns. For many it was the ultimate confirmation of Vale's thesis, that the Harrows had not been solitary conspirators, but initiates in a larger, unseen fellowship. By 1855 the legend had grown so formidable that travelers avoided the county after nightfall. Children recited rhymes about the sisters by candlelight, invoking their names to frighten one another. Yet scholars continued to mine the case for meaning, as though knowledge itself could act as a shield. Amos Burdett, compiler of the Harrow Register, produced a second edition that extended his genealogical chart to include other families linked by rumor to poisoning cases. His diagrams connected households across counties and states with spidery lines, until the Harrow tree resembled less a genealogy than a web. The image disturbed even those who mocked Burdett's methods, for the web implied not heredity alone, but design, as though invisible hands had woven households into a conspiracy spanning generations. Perhaps the most chilling testimony from this era came from a clergyman in York, who in a sermon delivered in 1856, confessed that he had heard confessions from 3 women who claimed descent from the Harrow line. They asked if blood could be cleansed when blood had already spoken. He told his congregation, "They named no crimes, yet their eyes bore the mark of guilt. I fear they did not seek forgiveness, but permission." The congregation sat in silence, too shaken to respond. Word of the sermon spread quickly, carried by rumor, until it seemed that any woman with Harrow blood, or even the rumor of it, was tainted with suspicion. Thus, by the close of the 1850s, the Harrows had ceased to be merely historical figures. They had become symbols of a hidden order, invoked in medicine, politics, folklore and superstition. Their crimes no longer belonged solely to Lancaster County. They had been absorbed into the national psyche, transmuted into a theory that beneath the orderly facade of American life lurked a clandestine current, passing silently through kitchens, marriages and inheritances. Whether this current was real or imagined mattered little. The fear itself had become self-sustaining, and in that fear, the sisters lived on. By the early 1860s, whispers hardened into accusations. For nearly 2 decades, the Harrow sisters had been remembered in pamphlets and broadsides, invoked in sermons, and studied in medical journals. Yet a chilling shift occurred in those years. The Harrows ceased to be remembered only as dead murderers. They were spoken of instead as if still active, their will carried out by others. The fragile boundary between history and present tense collapsed. The moment of rupture came in the summer of 1861,
When the estate of Abner Claiborne, a wealthy landowner in Chester County, fell under suspicion, Claiborne's sudden death was attributed at first to a stroke, but within weeks, a visiting physician, Dr. Elam Torrance, raised the alarm. His autopsy revealed a peculiar discoloration of the stomach lining, identical to descriptions in earlier Harrow inquests. More troubling still, Claiborne's young wife, Eliza, was discovered to have corresponded with Rebecca Harrow's surviving cousins in letters that the household servants intercepted and sold to the local press. Though the letters were largely domestic discussions of recipes, ailments, and social visits, Torrance noted one repeated phrase: "The measure must be precise, or the guest will not sleep." The wording sent chills through the county, for it echoed the measured cups described in Jane Harrow's own testimony nearly 20 years earlier. When Eliza Claiborne was arrested on suspicion of poisoning, she insisted she had merely learned household remedies from older women in Lancaster. She had never met the Harrows, yet she spoke of them as though they were instructors whose lessons still circulated. Her trial in Philadelphia became a grotesque reenactment of the Harrow affair. Journalists quickly labeled her the fifth sister, and the prosecution argued that she represented not an isolated widow but the continuation of a lineage of methodical killers. During the proceedings, the prosecution produced evidence that chilled the spectators: a leather-bound notebook recovered from Eliza's vanity, its margins filled with hand-drawn measurements of powders and tinctures, each paired with a woman's name. Among the names, one stood out with dreadful clarity: Annabel Harrow. How the notebook came into her possession was never explained. Eliza insisted it was a family heirloom given by cousins, but no records proved the connection. Regardless, the presence of the Harrow name within her private papers convinced the jury that she was not merely repeating coincidence, but deliberately inheriting the sisters' methods. Her conviction sent shockwaves through the region. To the public, it confirmed what had long been suspected, that the Harrow sisters had not died in isolation, but had left behind disciples, women who carried their formulas, their rhetoric, and their justifications into a new generation. But the Claiborne case was only the beginning. In the following 3 years, 3 more women, 2 in Delaware, 1 in Maryland, were accused of similar practices. Each case bore at least one uncanny resemblance to Lancaster: carefully staged illnesses, sudden windfalls of inheritance, and the presence of notebooks, recipe cards, or marginalia invoking measures and sleep. By the time the Civil War had reached its midpoint, Northern papers ran headlines that seemed almost superstitious in tone: "The Sisters Walk the South," "Lancaster's Poison Spreads," "Widows of the West." What had begun as local crime now seemed to have metastasized into a folk terror. Yet behind the sensational headlines, scholars attempted to impose order upon the chaos. In 1864, the Pennsylvania Medical Examiner published an extraordinary article by Dr. Torrance titled "On the Transmission of Domestic Knowledge in Criminal Form." He argued that the Harrow legacy exemplified a new form of hereditary contagion, not through blood alone but through what he called cultural osmosis. Women, he claimed, had passed recipes, measures, and rationalizations among one another in parlors and kitchens, turning private grief or resentment into codified murder. Just as scripture may be preserved across generations without alteration, Torrance wrote, so too may the Harrow doctrine travel from mother to daughter, cousin to niece, until a single family's evil becomes a dispersed tradition. This conclusion was greeted with both horror and fascination, for if Torrance was correct, the Harrows had founded not merely a conspiracy, but a tradition, diffuse and unstoppable. Even more chilling was the testimony uncovered by journalist Francis Merton, who in 1865 published a serialized account in the Philadelphia Inquirer. Merton claimed to have interviewed a woman confined to the Baltimore asylum who insisted she had attended a circle of women in which the Harrow name was spoken with reverence. According to her, the gatherings involved the recitation of maxims attributed to Bridget Harrow: "Do not wait for opportunity, create it at the table, measure twice for the hand is unsteady when the heart is sure, sleep is the kindest gift, we hasten it for those we love." Merton admitted that the woman's mental state was unstable, yet her words echoed so precisely the logic preserved in Lancaster records that they could not be dismissed as coincidence. The implication was horrifying: the Harrows' twisted philosophy had survived orally, like scripture, long after their deaths. This convergence of trials, testimonies, and writings produced a new climate of dread in Lancaster itself. Though decades had passed since the executions, the county was once again convulsed by suspicion. Families with even distant kinship to the Harrows found themselves shunned. Inheritance disputes were scrutinized with unusuals. A simple illness might now provoke whispers that the Harrows' poison had returned. The psychological toll was immense. One contemporary diarist recorded, We live in a county that mistrusts its own daughters. Every teacup trembles. Every cough recalls the gallows. The Harrows are dead, but they are not gone. The climax of this spreading dread came in late 1866, when authorities intercepted a trunk shipped from Philadelphia to Wilmington. Inside, carefully wrapped in linen, were 6 small glass vials, each labeled in a neat feminine hand. The substances were later identified as arsenic, morphine, and powdered foxglove, lethal if misused. Alongside the vials lay a folded parchment bearing only 5 words: "The circle shall not break." No recipient was ever identified. No sender was ever charged. The trunk vanished into federal custody, and the documents surrounding it were sealed, but news of its discovery leaked, and with it the certainty that a larger hidden organization was at work.
The Harrow sisters' legacy was no longer confined to rumor. It was tangible, packaged, and ready for shipment across state lines. Thus, Part 8 closes with the grim realization: the Harrow crimes had seeded not merely scandal, but an ongoing system of inheritance and instruction, one that threatened to outlive the very century. The year 1867 marked the moment when whispers hardened into revelation. For nearly 3 decades, scholars, physicians, and magistrates had debated whether the Harrow sisters were aberration or omen. That question, so long deferred, was answered with dreadful clarity when the federal investigation quietly assembled after the Claiborne trial at last made its findings public. What emerged was not a tale of 4 murderous women isolated in Lancaster, but the unveiling of a networked inheritance, woven so intricately through domestic life that it seemed impossible to untangle. The revelation came first through the testimony of Daniel Pritchard, a postal clerk in Wilmington. He confessed to having intercepted a series of letters in the spring of 1866 that bore uncanny resemblance to the Harrow writings of the though unsigned. Each was addressed to women scattered across 3 states. One letter read, "Remember always the virtue of patience. A body declines as surely as an orchard ripens. Intervene with care, lest your measure be exposed." Another, "The hearth is the altar, the cup is the instrument. What is given in trust may be taken in mercy." Pritchard had delivered the letters as instructed, but he copied their contents into his own ledger, fearing he had stumbled upon treason or sedition. When news of the intercepted trunk broke, he presented his ledger to authorities, confirming what many had feared. The Harrows had founded not merely a family plot, but a circulating correspondence, an underground scripture of poison. The federal inquiry, headed by Marshal William Davies, Jr., son of the very man who had presided over the sisters' arrest in 1840, began gathering testimonies across counties. What they discovered was staggering. In Maryland, a widowed seamstress admitted under questioning that she had inherited a book of recipes from her aunt, which included tinctures for soothing coughs, stomach cramps, and restless sleep. Among the benign remedies lay one chilling formula labeled only the Harrow measure. In Delaware, a schoolmistress was found to possess a tiny locket inscribed with the initials BH, inside of which was folded a slip of paper bearing the words, "Measure twice, bless one." And in Lancaster itself, a farmer's daughter confessed that her grandmother had told her tales of the Harrows as one might pass down hymns or proverbs, not as a warning but as a set of guiding principles for surviving a cruel world. When these discoveries were presented in federal court, the reaction was not outrage but dread, for the implications were undeniable. The Harrow sisters had succeeded in what few criminals could ever dream. They had outlived the gallows. Their doctrines had become transmissible, woven into the fabric of households and carried across generations. What frightened the investigators most was not the evidence of murder itself, but the language, the persistence of specific phrases repeated faithfully across decades and counties, as if memorized catechism. Marshal Davies, Jr., in his official summary, wrote, "We are not confronting individuals alone, but a liturgy. The Harrows created a creed of poison, and it is my fear that creed is not confined by state or border." The press seized upon the revelations with ravenous energy. Pamphleteers flooded city streets with broadsides warning of the widow's web and the poison catechism. One handbill bore the stark image of 4 shadowed figures, their mouths open as if speaking, while lines of text radiated outward from them like scripture. Meanwhile, sermons thundered with warnings that Satan himself had chosen women's parlors as his pulpit. Ministers railed against the doctrine of merciful sleep, condemning it as a perversion of Christian charity. But in private, many admitted their fear, that the contagion could not be stopped, for unlike bandits or rebels, the Harrow legacy required no armies, no banners. It traveled silently, from mother to daughter, from neighbor to neighbor, under the guise of household advice. The climax of revelation came in November of that year, when the federal investigators revealed their final discovery, a codex recovered from the attic of a farmhouse outside Lancaster, bound in cracked leather. The book contained over 50 entries, each in a different hand. Some were recipes for medicine, others instructions for poisoning, but all bore the same chilling preface, written in careful, deliberate script: the Harrow Doctrine to be preserved by the Circle and never destroyed. Scholars who examined the codex testified that its entries spanned nearly 30 years, from the late 1830s into the 18th. Each hand seemed to represent a different contributor, suggesting a living network rather than a single author. One passage, written in 1851, read, "The sisters fell, but the hearth remains. We tend the fire. We shall not let the measure be forgotten." Another, dated 1863, chillingly invoked the Civil War itself. "The nation consumes its sons. Who shall consume the fathers? The doctrine must answer where law has failed." The codex was more than ever. It was proof that the Harrows' crimes had been deliberately memorialized, expanded, and systematized. News of the codex unleashed a panic. If one book had survived, how many others might exist? How many households preserved fragments, notes, or whispered saying? The Harrows' evil was no longer a historical event. It was a living tradition, concealed in the most ordinary corners of American life. For the authorities, this revelation was unbearable. The codex was sealed in the archives of Philadelphia, and officials issued orders forbidding its reproduction. But already, copies had been made. Passages circulated clandestinely in taverns, in asylums, even in prison. What was meant to be suppressed became instead a forbidden scripture, all the more alluring for its secrecy. Thus the climax was reached. The Harrow sisters' story, once confined to Lancaster County, had been revealed as the seed of a clandestine creed, one that had survived their deaths and spread across states. The public asked the inevitable question: how could such a thing be stopped? And the answer, whispered in both fear and resignation, was that it could not, for a doctrine, unlike a person, cannot be hanged. When the codex was locked away in Philadelphia, it was assumed that silence might smother the doctrine. The officials who ordered its concealment believed, as men in office always do, that history is a matter of papers filed, evidence sequestered, and verdicts written. But history has its own temperament. It favors whispers over proclamations, memory over decree. Thus the final chapter of the Harrow sisters is not one of closure, but of persistence. By 1870, official discourse on the sisters had largely ceased. Newspapers shifted their attention to Reconstruction and industrial expansion. Sermons turned toward political reform. Yet in households across Pennsylvania and beyond, the language of the Harrows continued to circulate. In Shippensburg, a physician reported treating a young woman who had administered laudanum by the drop to her ailing uncle. When asked where she had learned such dosage, she replied simply, "It is the Harrow way." In Lancaster itself, school children were overheard reciting a chant, a rhyme passed from one generation to the next: "Measure twice, bless once. The sisters' fire is never done." Authorities attempted to dismiss these stories as folklore, but the recurrence of the phrases, always the same phrases, was difficult to explain away. The families who had once aligned themselves with the Harrows lived under a peculiar shadow. The Claibornes, forever linked to the trial, saw their estates splintered by lawsuits. The Pritchards, whose postal clerk had exposed the letters, endured decades of social suspicion, accused in whispers of having handled the poison themselves. Even those who had opposed the Harrows in court were not spared. Marshall Davies, Jr., who had declared that the sisters had founded a creed, was found dead in 1874 with a cup of unfinished tea beside his bed. No foul play was proven, but in Lancaster the story was told otherwise. The Harrows claimed him, as they claim us all. By the late 19th century, the sisters had ceased to be remembered as historical women at all. They became figures of dread and fascination, invoked in folklore much as one might invoke specters or demons. In some accounts they were witches who had bewitched the county with potions. In others, they were martyrs who had been unjustly condemned for practicing secret knowledge. In still others, they were whispered to walk by night, four shadows moving in unison along the Susquehanna. But beneath the layers of legend, one fact remained consistent: the doctrine they created had survived. What makes the Harrows' legacy unbearable is not simply the crimes they committed,
but the structure they left behind. Unlike isolated killers, their philosophy was transmissible. It reduced murder to household routine, cloaked in the language of mercy and care. The codex preserved in Philadelphia testifies to this transmission. The entries are not grandiose or dramatic. They are practical, banal, and terrifyingly ordinary. To soothe an infant's colic, grind valerian root, reads one line, followed by another. To ease a husband's rage, slip but one drop of the measure into his drink. The juxtaposition is unbearable. Comfort and death written side by side, as though one were no different from the other. By the turn of the century, antiquarians began quietly requesting access to the codex. Some sought to publish its contents, others merely to study. They were denied, but rumors spread that copies already circulated among private collections. One scholar in Boston claimed to have seen a duplicate in the library of a wealthy widow, its pages marked with annotations in a feminine hand. Another alleged that fragments of the codex had been smuggled to Europe, folded into the broader fascination with spiritualism and occult science. If true, it would mean the Harrow doctrine had escaped not only Lancaster County, but America itself. The question lingers, where does a doctrine end? Unlike a body, it cannot be buried. Unlike a crime, it cannot be expiated through punishment. In 1903, a farmer's wife in Maryland poisoned her abusive husband with arsenic. When interrogated, she did not deny it. Instead, she said, "It was the Harrow gift. My mother taught me." The statement chilled the core, for even after 70 years, the sister's name was still invoked, not as curse, but as inheritance. Thus the aftermath is one of collapse, yes, but also of continuation. The Harrows themselves are long dead, their bodies dust beneath the Lancaster soil, yet their voices persist, carried not in speech, but in habits, remedies, whispers, and quiet cups prepared in shadowed kitchen. Every generation since has asked whether the doctrine truly died with the codex, or whether it remains alive, scattered among households that still pass down a phrase, a recipe, a rhyme. And here lies the terror. The doctrine requires no central keep. It requires no book, no codex, no grand conspiracy. All it requires is memory, and the willingness of one person to believe mercy and death might be the same thing. Tonight, if you pour a drink, and leave it unattended, pause. If someone you trust prepares your tea, pause again. And if you hear the rhyme, measure twice, bless once. Ask yourself whether you are hearing folklore or instruction. For the Harrow sisters are not gone. They are waiting, as they have always waited, in the silence between trust and betrayal. And should you dismiss them as relic, consider this. A sealed box remains in Philadelphia, its contents too dangerous for public release. Inside lies the codex, and if you listen closely enough, you may hear the turning of its pages still. They wait at the hearth, they wait at the cup, and when the measure is taken, it is never forgotten.